I'm Carl, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week, we're going to be looking at the 2000 Oscars. Last week, we covered the sort of post 9/11 Oscars. Now, this is the pre 9/11 Oscars, eventually ending into the 90s as we sort of work our way backwards. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is pick a movie that was nominated for Best Picture that I believe to be sort of forgotten to time. A movie that has less cultural importance, less cultural relevance, one that isn't necessarily talked about all the time, and try to understand why that is. Essentially, this show works in three parts. The first is to give us a little bit of historical context, break down the Oscars, who won, who was nominated, why I ultimately chose the movie I did. Then my thoughts on the movie, because for many of these movies, I am watching them for the very first time. And then trying to answer that central question as to why this movie was forgotten and not something like the eventual Best Picture winner, Gladiator. But when I think of the 2000s Oscars, I actually think of it being very representative of the decade to come. That not necessarily every, beginning, 2010 wasn't necessarily the beginning of the 2010s and whatnot. That oftentimes it takes a few years before movies really start to define a decade. But when I think of the 2000s Oscars, I really do look at this group of movies that really tell a good story about not only what's popular in the 2000s, but also what gets nominated in the 2000s. Now, this is a bit of a weird year because it does represent the upcoming 2000s, which I thought was maybe a poor decade compared to the 90s or the 2010s. But, I think a lot of people really appreciated this year, and this year definitely has its fans. But it is also the year coming right after 1999, which is considered one of the greatest years in movies, sort of definitively. So this is kind of in a lull period, and will never sort of live up to the hype of 99, but of course there's going to be its own sort of fans. I'm sure I'll hear that in the comments down below. The 2000s is a sort of secretly great decade, or this year is a secretly great year. But while I actually do like this crop of Best Picture nominees, I do think they sort of represent some of the negative elements of the Oscars and the movies that were nominated, because Hollywood, of course, takes the wrong, necessarily, messages from other successes. And at the center of this Oscars year was a big throwback win. Gladiator winning the sort of throwback to Ben-Hur and even Lawrence of Arabia, the sort of swords and sandals epics that also would win Best Picture in the 60s. Ridley Scott, well-acclaimed director. Russell Crowe peaking at this right time. Kind of seen as sort of a populist kind of movie even at the time, and it sort of lived up to that reputation. A very strange year in the sense that, this was a movie that was released in May, I believe. So it was like a summer blockbuster that ultimately won Best Picture. It's once again a rarity nowadays that the third highest grossing movie at the box office would end up winning Best Picture. That seems almost unheard of nowadays, but of course it was very common in the 70s and the 80s and even still into the 2000s and up into the Lord of the Rings and movies like that, becoming increasingly rare but still existing. And Gladiator is still a movie that stands the test of time and has its loyal fan base and is quoted and referenced. This was also a big year for Steven Soderbergh, who had both Aaron Brockovich and Traffic. Both got nominated for Best Picture, and he was nominated for Best Director for both of them, ultimately winning for Best Director for Traffic. But both of those movies, Steven Soderbergh, this was sort of peak him. He has Ocean's 11 coming up right after this, so he does the two big kind of Oscar movies, and then has like this huge populist hit in Ocean's 11 and spawns that franchise. So, he's a very important director, I think, in the history of sort of late 90s. He has these sort of great moments throughout film history that he's very important with. So I think he'll always be remembered, and he's a well-appreciated, well-celebrated director. And this is his most historical time, so he'll always be remembered for this. And if anything, it's a great Oscar stacked. And a movie like Aaron Brockovich is also a movie that's being played on cable all the time, and is a seminal Julia Roberts role because of also her win for the Oscar. So there's many reasons for both those movies, I think, existing as sort of a tandem, but still ultimately will always be remembered as a tandem in that respect. And then the fourth movie being Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which is one of the most successful foreign films of all time that really resonated with American audiences. I don't think Parasite would have won Best Picture had not Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon been nominated here in the 2000s Oscars. Of course, Ang Lee goes on to have a great career getting 2 Best Director Oscars in Life of Pi and Brokeback Mountain, so he's still a well-acclaimed, well-celebrated director. This is him coming up after Sense and Sensibility, which got a Best Picture nomination, and The Ice Storm, and he's really riding hot right now. And then the final movie is Chocolat, which is a sort of reflection of the earlier days of the Academy, where I actually think the other 4 nominees are a representation of what's to come, like I mentioned at the top. I mean, if you take a movie like Gladiator, I don't think we have Troy or Alexander without Gladiator. You know, that's the kind of movies we get afterwards, the big sort of sword and sandals epics, which ultimately kind of fail. I mean, I don't think Crash would have won Best Picture if it weren't for Traffic. You know, so that's the sort of linearity there. I think Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, of course, has ties to, you know, Parasite and other sort of foreign language films. You know, there's a clear direction there, but in terms of just its popularity, Kill Bill we get later on. You could even say movies like Equilibrium and Dragon Ball Evolution have been inspired for that sort of negatively. I think Aaron Brockovich, you could say, we got movies like Dark Waters all the way into 2019, but something like North Country or Changing Lanes, these sort of legal dramas that maybe necessarily don't hold up or don't have as much cultural relevance. So in many ways, you know, I look at these 4 movies and I go, wow, these are all 4 great movies that are culturally relevant. I mean, Chocolat is very much the forgotten out of the 4, but I think it's so relevant to the 2000s because this was an integral year where the movies that were supposed to get nominated didn't. You know, you look at a movie like Aaron Brockovich, that was released in March. You look at a movie like Gladiator, that was released in May. Well, the Oscars, if you know, almost always nominate movies that were released in November or near the end of the year that are top of the mind. So if you remember, actually, from this year, we had movies like Finding Forrester and Men of Honor. A lot of the sort of big supposed Oscar movies ended up failing and actually didn't resonate. So the Oscars had to sort of look around and look for the foreign cinema and look for sort of earlier summer blockbusters and crowd pleasers like Aaron Brockovich and Gladiator. And I think because of that, because those sort of Oscar-baiting movies failed, we get to celebrate, and looking back on this year, it's like, wow, this Best Picture lineup is actually pretty great because of that. But it's an interesting sort of divergence, I think, because those Oscar movies fail. These movies that are sort of box office hits and have the critical acclaim and get nominated for Best Picture become indicative of what the future of the 2000s are. For worse in many ways, but also for better. You know, there's just Hollywood likes to copy itself. Whatever was hit the last thing, they're going to immediately follow up with, and that doesn't, of course, doesn't make necessarily a great movie. And then with Chocolat, I mentioned that I think it's really a culmination of the 90s rather than it is a future projection of the 2000s. That in many ways, Chocolat is a classic Miramax film. Now, we've talked about Miramax and sort of dodged the issue on other episodes, and we will talk about it in full, I think, near the end of this season, because there's going to be many more Miramax movies we're going to be talking about, so I want to talk about it in finality once we've covered all of them. But this is a classic movie like The Cider House Rules, or I think Shakespeare in Love, where the Miramax and, you know, Harvey Weinstein discounting all this horrible crimes was an incredibly influential figure, particularly in this time of the Oscars, that he's impossible to not mention because of how dominant his studio was at getting these Oscar nominations, and many times for movies that are forgotten. I mean, I'm going to be covering movies. We've already covered, you know, Seabiscuit, Chicago, you know, In the Bedroom. I mean, 3 in a row, or 4 in a row now, they're all Miramax movies that have been covered on this series, Forgotten Oscar Films. So the movies that they produced even felt kind of odd at the time, but it was a testament to how incredible their campaigning was, how they were able to generate buzz for a film that made something feel important. Even something like Chocolat, where even the Academy at the time, I think, sort of felt almost kind of duped into thinking that this was more of an important film than it actually was. So we'll talk about Miramax a little bit later, but it is, I think, Chocolat is a classic sort of overly sentimental, manipulative, seemingly important, but not really, kind of a movie that is sort of saved in many ways by the campaigning, by the sort of strength of, you know, a studio. Fox Searchlight, you know, has their own studios. Miramax, of course, you know, DreamWorks at the time. So there's always these big studios, but Miramax was really the center of it because they were able to make these movies that weren't necessarily even that culturally relevant at the time, and definitely haven't held up, feel more important than they are. And because of the result of that, we have a series like this, Forgotten Oscar Films, which tries to cover and document why these movies were more relevant than they were. And I think Chocolat is a classic example of that. Like I said, foreign, overly sentimental, big movie stars, seemingly important French, so an air of sophistication, but ultimately kind of more interested in appealing to the Academy and checking boxes than it is so with making a unique, original, great film. But my thoughts on Chocolat are kind of surprising how this movie did get nominated for Best Picture. When I was even watching it, I was like, this has got nominated for Best Picture? Not because it's necessarily like a terrible movie. It's just that it's kind of blasé. I mean, this is a very low concept movie. It's about a woman in a sort of small, idyllic French town who opens up a chocolatier and essentially sort of wins over the town against the sort of evilish mayor and his sort of Catholic grip over the city. And they sort of fall in love with chocolate. And there's these great sequences where she's making chocolate and she's picking out the right ones, and there's interesting sort of great sensuality to it. But ultimately, it's a very low stakes movie. Not a lot happens into it. It's sort of, in many ways, I think people would describe it as delightful or sweet or charming. But in terms of my sort of personal opinion, I found it a little bit flat. I found it a little bit kind of, like I said, low stakes and emotionally unavailable. And kind of, I was sort of considering while I was watching the movie why this movie got nominated for Best Picture. And that maybe be unfair to it because, it didn't ask to get nominated for Best Picture. It's just sort of this sort of small, sentimental, kind of French-ish movie because they're all speaking in English. So I wasn't particularly offended, or I didn't think the movie didn't work. Like I look at a movie like Crash and I go, that movie doesn't really work. Or Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. That movie doesn't really work in that sense. This movie works, except for it didn't work on me. So I look at it and I go, yes, I understand why people think it's delightful. I understand why people think it's a sweet, nice movie. I couldn't totally resonate to it. But, I could mention things like, how, because this is a sort of a fantasy idyllic town, the emotions aren't necessarily as resonant, so I felt detached from the story. I could feel like I could say that the acting was over the top and incredibly detached, and some performances are way over the top and some are much more subtle than they need to be. So, I could say all these things as to why it didn't work with me, but at the end of the day, it is a well-crafted movie. It does work for some people, but I'm more concerned, about why this movie was forgotten. For me, it didn't work. So maybe for people my age and rewatching in the sort of the new generation, it doesn't work as well. That maybe it seemed more important than it was, but it's really just sort of a sweet-ish movie. And sometimes it works for you, but then some people, it just doesn't work at all. And when a movie's trying to be charming and you're not charmed by it, well, it becomes a little bit boring, which is kind of my experience with it. But in terms of it being forgotten, I do think that this is a kind of a mold that is underrated in terms of its popularity. Movies like in 2015, I'm thinking of Brooklyn. In 2016, I'm thinking of Hidden Figures. Or even, Jojo Rabbit in 2018. These movies that are sort of sweet, sentimental, they're a little bit predictable. There's not a lot of sort of grand themes going on with it, but they're very well appreciated and enjoyable at the time. That being said, they're very much like maybe single-use plastics. Enjoyable at the time, but you never want to rewatch them again. You kind of forgot that you even saw it, even, a couple months later. You forget about the plot details and things like that. And ultimately, when you're in the Oscar season and you have Hidden Figures pushed upon you and it seems important and it's a good time at the movies, you want to nominate it without thinking about how it's going to last in terms of the long withstanding kind of cultural attitude and relevancy. That doesn't really matter. So when we're talking about why this movie was forgotten, well, in one sense, it's a strange Best Picture winner because it doesn't feel as important. It doesn't feel like a movie that, deserves that sort of, this is a classic movie and should be represented and awarded at its time. It kind of feels like a sort of smaller independent movie that is charming for some, but fine for me, so it didn't really work as well. So like I said, that kind of fine element that maybe other people have experienced is the reason why it has been sort of forgotten. But I think a movie like Brooklyn or Hidden Figures are more recent examples of movies that are starting to become less remembered because of that sort of structure. That sometimes you have the big serious movie, sometimes you have sort of the culturally changing movie, but most movies can't be that. And sometimes I like them, like Finding Neverland, I'm a big fan of, but that's kind of in a similar category. You know, that don't necessarily encourage rewatches, that are sort of predictable, follow similar structure, but are still enjoyable and heartwarming and a great time at the movies. Chocolat kind of fits into that, but like I said, when you have a charming movie that's supposed to charm you and then it doesn't, it feels a little bit trite at the end of the day. So in many ways, Chocolat is forgotten because it fits into this classic Oscar mold that often does get forgotten. The movie that's easily enjoyable, easily understandable on first watch, but doesn't reward those multiple rewatches, doesn't have necessarily a strong directorial style or flourish, or even the best performances from these actors. It does sort of feel, looking back on it, like the Miramax kind of almost duped the Academy at the time, because it doesn't feel like sort of this important movie. And, you know, I don't want to put that on Chocolat. It doesn't claim to be an important movie, but at the time the Academy recognized it as one of the best movies of the year, and that's why we're covering the series, because it was nominated for Best Picture, and because ultimately it was forgotten. And ultimately every year the Academy does make one or two mistakes in terms of movies that they thought would be culturally relevant and then ultimately are not. You know, that's the reason for this series, and Chocolat, I think, is a classic example of, you know, these four great movies, two which are tied to a great director, the other two tied to great directors in Ang Lee and Ridley Scott, and are rewatched and part of, you know, cinematic history. I mean, Gladiator is a well-remembered movie, quotable, it's up there, it's a pop cultural phenomenon. And then you look at something like Chocolat, and I think it has very little cultural footprint and seems like an odd choice. So when looking back on it, I'm trying to understand why it's been forgotten, and I think that sort of mold of it being sort of enjoyable can be sort of the main culprit, at least to me. And also, you know, maybe some people have similar opinions to me in terms of its, you know, I don't know how well it's aged in that sense of maybe not being as charming as it once was. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please comment down below, let me know your thoughts on Chocolat, what you thought of this 2000s movie year. You know, movies like Almost Famous, Pollock, what else, Billy Elliot we had this year. There were some, you know, interesting, You Can Count on Me, interesting movies that were pretty good. And I actually really did like this Best Picture lineup, even though it was kind of a representation of the worst elements of the decade to come, as Hollywood tries to copy some of the success it sees this year. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.